So what happened is that in the federal government had been putting a lot of pressure on the church to give up polygamy. And at this time, I don't know how, but they dissolved the church as an entity and threatened, well, they actually did take possession of some of the church's properties and threatened that they would take all the church's properties if the church didn't give up polygamy. So in 1890, the church published what they called the Manifesto, which basically declared to the world that they were no longer going to engage in polygamy. Again, long story short, what the church did officially and what the church did secretly were two different things. That between 1890 and 1904, there are recorded almost 300 polygamous marriages which occurred in the temples with the permission of the leaders of the church. So they were still doing it even at this point in 1890. They were not even to cohabit with their prior polygamous wives. They were supposed to just, turn them out, basically. But that's when, like this woman that I've told you about, everybody went into hiding, and a lot of the families went to Mexico because they wanted to get away from the federal government. And I grew up believing that they went to Mexico because polygamy was not illegal in Mexico. That was a lie. And I was taught that over and over and over again. It was just as illegal in Mexico as it was in America. But at some point, one of the church leaders went to the authorities in Mexico and said, we want to build this little town over the border. If we come over there with our polygamous wives, will you let us alone? And whoever it was he spoke to said, yes, you can do it. But it was against the law. Now, there is evidence that polygamous marriages in the mainstream Mormon church went on in the temples until about 1920. And at that time, the church began to excommunicate people who openly were living polygamy. And that's where the history of the FLDS stuff that you're seeing in the news today. Now, I need to go back because when the saints went to Utah, there were quite a few who had a problem with polygamy who stayed back in Illinois, including Emma Smith, the widow of Joseph. She never could accept it, and she denied her entire life that Joseph had had a revelation. He claimed he'd shown it to her on a piece of paper. She claimed she'd never seen it. She never could accept it. He would marry women and bring them into their home, and within a few weeks she'd kick them out. She just could never live it. And so when they left, there was a long period of time where that group back in the East just was kind of disorganized and claimed to be Mormons, but didn't really have an organized church. They were formally organized again in 1860. Then in 1872, they added the name Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that's the group that I was familiar with growing up. In 2001, they changed their name totally to Community of Christ. And sometime before this, I think it was 1997 or so, they gave their women the priesthood, which was a huge, change for them. So that church has existed. They've never accepted polygamy. They are not part of any of the polygamy stuff you're seeing today. Their headquarters are in, is it Illinois? I think it's Illinois. And they own one of the original temples of the church, which just, gets in the craw of the Mormons because they want it back. So that's separate from what you're seeing here. The fundamentalist LDS. They, at about 1920, when the church started excommunicating the members, is when these break-off groups started kind of breaking off and started living polygamy secretly. And their position is that there never was a revelation to end polygamy, that the mainstream church is the apostate church because they gave up polygamy. And it's the central core of their religion. They believe in the Book of Mormon. They believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. They believe in the structure of the priesthood, sort of kind of like the mainstream church does. But the difference is that they say the mainstream church is apostate because they gave up polygamy. So that's 1920 is when these secret groups began to form. Now, presently today, it's because it's so hidden, it's hard to know. There are approximately 40,000 people within the Utah, Arizona area living polygamy in these different communities. There's another group up in Canada, but some people who have researched think that there's over 100,000 people living polygamy who are associated back to the mainstream church, that they're definitely splinter groups from the original concepts. And what's happened, and particularly recently in the things that you're seeing in the news, is that over a period of time, particularly in the community that Warren Jeffs was in, who's been in the news so much, they just became more rigid as time went on and weirder about their dress and their clothing. And you've seen the pictures of the women with their hairdos. And this book right here is written by Carolyn Jessup. And if you've watched the news at all about the Texas thing, you may have seen her interviewed. She was married at age 18 to a man who was in his early 50s. She was, I believe, the 5th wife. And began having children. She ended up with, one every year. She ended up with 8 kids. And her husband, Merrill Jessup, is a cousin to Warren Jeffs. And when they began the compound in Texas, the reason they did that was because finally the state of Utah started kind of coming in on them. And there's a lot of welfare fraud and stuff that goes on in these communities because these women are not legally married to these men. So they can go to the state and get age-dependent children and welfare. And the state knows they're living in these polygamous communities. They know that they're the wives of these men, but since they're not really legally married, they have a right to go get this aid. So the state of Utah spends millions of dollars a year helping support these polygamous communities. And they've kind of turned their back on it because the Mormons have so much influence in politics. I mean, the legislature in Utah is probably 85% Mormon. And so they just want to ignore it. They don't want it public. And of course, it's all blown up this last year and a half or so. But anyway, she finally escaped, took her 8 kids in the middle of the night. Her 2 oldest children, she had to literally drag because they're so indoctrinated. They said, "Mother, you're going to go to hell for taking us," and so forth and so on. But she did leave, and her husband is the one that Warren Jeffs put in charge of the Texas compound. So he is the one who was in charge when this raid took place. And the oldest, the #1 wife that she talks a lot about in this book is a very abusive woman. And there's a lot of stuff in this book and some of the other stories. This is another one. This one was written about, there's like 20 stories in here of women who escaped polygamy. And they all talk about the physical abuse. There is, we hear a lot about the sexual abuse, but there is a tremendous amount of physical abuse of the children. That's how they discipline. And I don't know how much you saw of the stuff that came out about the Texas thing, but 40 of those children had previous broken bones when they took x-rays of them. And that's kind of dropped off the map a little, so I don't know what's going on down there and what the final resolution will be. But there's just a tremendous lot of abuse, and the girls are very young, and the whole thing is just, but it all, what I want to get to here, and then I'm going to open for questions, is when the church says that they have nothing to do with the FLDS, technically, yes, they do excommunicate people who are polygamous, but they are still, denying the connection and where it all came from. And in Mormon doctrine, in the scriptures, this scripture that I've shown you that was included in 1876 in canonized scripture is still there. They have never taken it out, and Mormon men can be married to more than one woman if their wife dies, or if they divorce and that ceremony that goes on in the temple is not nullified. Mormon doctrine still teaches that you will live polygamy in the next life if you choose to. So for them to disassociate themselves from the FLDS is disingenuous, because it is still part of Mormon doctrine. Okay, questions?